Well, last week, the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves released her interim report on the challenges of searches for unmarked graves. The report highlights 12 common concerns raised by residential school survivors, Indigenous families, and communities as they search for unmarked graves and missing children. Some of those concerns include access to and destruction of records, accountability and justice, and the increase in the violence of residential school denialism. Kimberly Murray is the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Kimberly Murray, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Denialism is really at the core of this report. What are you seeing in terms of residential school denialism, and how widespread does this appear to be?
Well, what I've been learning as I've been speaking to survivors and communities that are doing the sacred work of recovering the children is that every time a community makes an announcement of their findings from their ground searches, there's this influx of hate mail and attacks on the communities and the survivors through social media, through attending at the sites, to showing up with a shovel, indicating they want to find the evidence for themselves. And lots of trespassing happening on the very sacred grounds where the children are buried. And so it seems to be escalating. And there's a core group of individuals that are sort of made it their full-time job to take on this attack. And I'm very concerned about it. It's harmful, and it's really hurting the survivors and the communities as they're trying to heal from the recoveries that they're doing.
Not to minimize the emails and those sorts of things, but that's a fairly common response to some issues. But showing up with shovels, how common is that, and what's happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's not just that. There's people showing up on the grounds, and with the lack of security, because the funding is not sufficient for communities to have 24/7 security on the grounds. Individuals have actually shown up and brought metal detectors and searched the grounds and posted on social media as their activities, what they're doing, and yet no one's taking action and bring charges against them for trespass. And we're really seeing a failure of the justice system in responding. I think it's all harmful, including the emails. We have enough evidence, the TRC and survivors' testimony, there's enough evidence that there are burials on these institutional grounds. We don't have to put pictures of children's remains on social media or on news webcasts and broadcasts for people to believe that there are children that died in these institutions and they're buried on these grounds.
Yes, and I certainly wasn't trying to imply on my question that the emails aren't harmful. It's just I've never heard of people showing up with shovels before and threatening to dig for themselves. That's a whole different level of escalation, because you've said that the residential school denialists, they're growing increasingly violent. Is this what you're talking about, or are there other ways? And if so, how do you confront that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not only like the incident where they showed up and saying they wanted to check for themselves. There's people, scurrying in the grass and hiding and spying and flying drones over the properties to see what the communities are doing, and really not leaving them the space and time for them to grieve and mourn and do the sacred work that they need to do, and really interfering with the process. And it's actually slowing down some of the searches that need to happen because of the attention and the harmful attention that some individuals are giving to the communities.
So the Justice Minister, David Lametti, said that he was open to all possibilities to address denialism. I mean, has the federal government offered support? What would you like to see from them to deal with this in particular?
Yeah, well, as Minister Lametti said, we did amend the criminal code not that long ago to deal with anti-Semitism and denialism of the Holocaust. And so there is a precedent in Canada to see if there's something we can do to put more teeth into our laws to try and deter people from this activity. But I also, call on local police services and Crown prosecutors like to take this seriously because we do have some laws in place now that can put a stop to some of this activity. But no one seems to be triggering any of the tools that are available to them. So I would like to see a draft legislation. I understand that. NDP MP Leah Gaza is proposing some draft legislation, and so I look forward to seeing that.
Mhm.
And, for all those people that are contacting me on social media and in my inboxes, I mean, that'll be very good evidence for me to take to the House when they debate this issue, whether there should be new legislation. We are collecting quite a collection of evidence of the harmful activity that is coming towards me and my office and towards communities as they do this sacred work.
You make a very good point that existing harassment and trespass laws are a way to deal with some of this, and perhaps we can get an explanation as to why that isn't being done. But I know one of the other challenges that people who want to bring the children home, as they say, have struggled with are getting access to documents, either from government or from churches. Where are things on that? Have you seen any movement or willingness to hand over the documents that you need to do this work?
Yeah, I mean, we are working with the different institutions, and communities are working individually, locally with dioceses and different provincial archives. The process is very slow. Archives are completely underfunded, don't have the staff to keep up with the demand. And then, of course, we have the privacy laws that are getting in the way and infringing and impeding the work that communities need to do. So we do need some legislative change in that regard, and I will be looking at making recommendations towards legislative change around our Privacy Act. All our legislations, provincial and federal, have a clause that say the chief archivist can disclose information if it's in the public interest. And I would say that this is in the public interest to disclose these records to communities that are specifically searching for missing children.
You're 1 year into a 2-year mandate. I wonder if you can give us an assessment of how responsive you think the federal government has been to your findings, and realistically, how much change do you think you can create by the end of your mandate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when it comes to the federal government, in the last year, there have been some issues that I've brought to their attention that they've been very responsive and corrected. For example, some of the original funding restrictions that they were imposing on community have been lifted. Originally they said you can't use the funding to do DNA testing or exhumation. And so now they've assured communities that they can use the funding for that if that's what they choose to do. They weren't allowing communities to use the funding to hire lawyers to negotiate all of these memorandums of understanding that they had in place. They've lifted that. So, so they have been responsive to in some senses, but I'm very concerned with some other issues that they've barriers they've created. And, one of those barriers is telling families that have found their missing children in cemeteries across the country that were buried there in unmarked burials when the family was never told, and now they're finding them and they want to bring them home. And Canada's saying, well, you have to prove that they were in an Indian residential school. And we're learning, as you saw in my report, that children were transferred between all kinds of institutions.
Right.
And we shouldn't put the onus on families and survivors and communities to prove that the child first went to an Indian residential school before they were transferred to a sanatorium or a mental health institution where they died and were buried thousands of miles away from their family, especially when our own laws are stopping communities from being able to get the information to prove that the child was at a residential school. I mean, it's silly, right? It's silly. The children were taken by Canada and taken to all these institutions, and Canada has a moral obligation to bring those children home if that's what the family wishes to do, to pay for that exhumation. So I'm, going to have conversations with Minister Miller and his office about what he can do to support families in that situation.
No, that's an excellent point you make. If privacy laws and lack of staffing at archives are stopping you from getting the documents you need to prove these things, that lack of proof then cannot be an impediment in family reunification.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Well, listen, when you get an update on that one, Kimberly Murray, please come back and talk to us about it, because you're doing important work and we appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, David.